Welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Sarah Wong. Like many other sectors, the foreign domestic helper workforce in Hong Kong has taken a hit during the pandemic. The number of helpers has declined from more than 400,000 2 years ago to around 350,000 today. The shrinking workforce not only affects families, which may need a helper, but also the local labor market, as workers may need to quit their jobs to take over the caring duty. Well, let's bring in Mark Cheung, president of the Overseas Group, to discuss the demands of the foreign domestic helpers employment agencies industry. He is also the director of Hong Kong Employment Agencies Association. Mike, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, for our audience who may not be familiar of what the capacity of your agency, can you introduce a little bit of what your agency do, what your duty is, and why do you think Hong Kong's domestic helper workforce is in such a tough spot right now?
Right, so Overseas Group, we deploy workers all over the world, including Hong Kong, Singapore, and many Middle Eastern countries such as Kuwait, KSA, UAE. So we do deploy overseas workers all over. And we've seen that, particularly in Hong Kong with the pandemic, as you say, the numbers have dropped precipitously from pre-pandemic about 400,000 to about 350,000 today. We think that with the recent flight bans now in the Philippines, and as well as a dramatic drop in the flights from Indonesia and Thailand, that things are not looking good. I think these headwinds are going to persist for quite a while. We don't know when this pandemic or these restrictions are going to go away. And so we really don't see any light at the end of the tunnel at this point.
And what are the specific, can you give us maybe some example as to what's the specific impact of the pandemic and the various restrictions like the flight bans you just mentioned on the recruitment efforts on your agency?
Right. So, with flight bans from the Philippines, workers essentially cannot fly over to Hong Kong. There's not enough flights as well from Indonesia. We're down to about one flight per week. And so what that's meant is that there's essentially a stoppage. There's no workers really coming in, or it's slowed down to trickle from overseas. And so employers, they have to hire locally workers who are already based in Hong Kong. When you have workers whose contracts are ending and many of them go back to the Philippines, that's led to a progressive drop in the numbers of workers here. So in the last year, we saw about a 30% decrease in the number of visa applications compared to the year before. That kind of decline is very steep in just 1 year. It's frankly historic. And so what you're seeing is that families are simply unable to hire workers locally to make up that shortfall. One in five Hong Kong families currently hire a domestic helper. And so, the majority, I would say, the vast majority of that 1 in 5 Hong Kong families who are hiring a domestic helper, they're hiring because they have a child at home who needs to be taken care of, they have elderly parents who need to be taken care of. And unlike many other advanced economies, we really don't have the alternative systems in place to provide these services. And so they simply can't hire a helper. And definitely from the agency standpoint, we've taken a hit. Right now, I took an informal poll of our association members. Year on year, we're down about 40% business in the last month. Looking at flight bans from last year, what really happens is the longer these flight bans are in place, the less inclined employers are going to take a risk on hiring a helper, not knowing when they'll be able to deploy to Hong Kong. And so the longer this goes on, the more likely employers are just going to forego hiring a helper, at least for the time being. And last year, there were months when we saw business drop by 50 or 60%. And it's a figure that we think is very realistic, again, in weeks and months ahead.
Well, so it sounded like the demand in Hong Kong locally for domestic helpers is still very robust. And I'm wondering, has the COVID situation, especially the current fifth wave in Hong Kong, dampened the appetite for overseas workers coming into Hong Kong?
Certainly, there is less demand, but that is outstripped by the overwhelming persisting supply. The demand is still there. Yes, fewer employers are hiring helpers, but because we have a supply crunch, demand is always going to sort of overtake supply. And so right now the issue is not we don't have enough workers willing to come here. The crux of this is us not having enough quarantine hotel rooms to service the workers who are willing to come here and deploy. There simply aren't enough. We are heartened to hear today the government is adding 2 more hotels, so that brings the number of sort of total hotel rooms that are designated for domestic helpers at about 2,700 rooms. That's not enough. That's not even close to enough. And though we're encouraged by this and the recognition that we need more rooms, the fact of the matter is, as long as we have this sort of 2-track approach where domestic helpers must stay in designated hotels for them and everyone stays in hotels for everyone else, we're always going to have this problem, and the supply of helpers is going to continue to be constrained. Now, we understand why the government had, or government policy had this 2-track approach in the first place. If you look back last year when the pandemic, happened, and we had a flight ban for the Philippines for many months, and then that flight ban was sort of removed, right, and they can come again. We had this huge backlog of 6,000 or 7,000 workers who needed to be processed, and the government understandably wanted to mitigate the risk of importing COVID by sort of artificially holding the numbers who can come in by having these designated hotels. There was a secondary issue where we weren't sure if the vaccination records from helpers could be trusted. It was the Philippines' first time of doing a national registry. But what we found in the months since is that domestic helpers simply don't have a higher risk profile compared to other groups. We haven't had any cross-infection cases where this came from the helper. In fact, the only case we had was there was a cross-infection of someone who was not a domestic helper, infecting a helper. So really, there is not this higher risk profile when it comes to helpers. So we feel that as we evolve the situation, we really should consider no longer having this sort of designated hotel system for helpers, and we're hopeful that they can and their employers can book for them any hotel room just like anyone else from any other group.
So essentially, you're saying that the back and forth slapping of flight bans and the arrangement of quarantine hotel, the whole thing is not a sustainable mechanism or sustainable model to recruit foreign domestic helpers during the time of the pandemic. What otherwise will you suggest the government to do? Because I heard the Secretary for Labor and Welfare, Cheung, he's been stressing that it's important to increase the data for foreign domestic helpers to come to Hong Kong. But right now, it's just very hard things to do.
No, if you have the hotel rooms, you make those rooms available, they will come. I mean, looking at this pre-pandemic, we had upwards of 500 workers come to Hong Kong per day. We're nowhere near that now. We're down to about 100 per day, and this is before the latest restrictions. So the demand is there. Hong Kong continues to be an attractive market. Absent of these policies, it has higher salaries compared to other locations. It has very robust labor laws. People want to come here. Hong Kong has always had a good track record of attracting domestic helpers. It's just with these latest policies where even if a helper is willing to endure a 21-day quarantine and the employer is willing to pay for it, the rooms are not available for them to come. They can't come. And so when you compare this to places like Singapore, where quarantine is now slashed down to 7 days, coming in from Indonesia, certainly from some islands down in Asia, there's no quarantine at all. Singapore becomes much more attractive. Even though pre-pandemic, we feel that Hong Kong has always been a more attractive option for domestic helpers vis-a-vis Singapore, and we deploy to both places.
Now let's talk about the solution that your agency, the industry, put forward. Essentially, I understand that industry is seeking 100,000 to 150,000 Hong Kong dollar subsidy per employment agency, as well as additional subsidies to workers at larger agencies for a period of 6 months to essentially tide them over this difficult period. Very simple. Why do you think this demand should be prioritized, given the economic environment is harsh in Hong Kong for every other sector, such as hospitality, such as catering sector? And if you're in the shoes of the government officials, why do you think that should be given priority?
Well, as I said, this is not just about employment agencies in our industry. This is about Hong Kong families. 1 in 5 Hong Kong families hire a domestic helper. We know from recent study from Baptist University that came out in November that families who want to hire a domestic helper but are unable to are significantly less likely to have a second child. Families who want to hire a domestic helper but are unable to spend less time with their children, are less able to rejoin the workforce. So this is a problem for society. This is not just for our industry. And might I add that even if we were to get the subsidies, and we're not getting our hopes up given the size of the subsidy scheme fund, but even if we were to get these subsidies, it'll help, I think, a lot of the smaller agencies afloat, or keep them afloat. But it's a Band-Aid solution. It really is. The longer term solution, as I mentioned, is increasing the number of quarantine hotel rooms. And a better solution is no longer having sort of a designation of domestic helper and non-domestic helper rooms. I think those are the real asks that we have. Certainly, subsidies would be helpful, but again, we're not keeping our hopes up at this point.
Okay, well, let's pick it up after the break. Talk the Walk will be back in a moment. Stay with us.